It's not easy for African countries to make it onto the front pages or primetime television news shows. I know, I spent 3 years as a New York Times correspondent on that troubled continent. But in recent days, President Trump has voiced concern and said he was willing to take action to address the massacres of Christians in Nigeria and the brutal ongoing civil war in Sudan. We're going to discuss these and other trouble spots today with Alberto Fernandez, Vice President of the indispensable Middle East Media Research Institute, better known as MEMRI. Previously, Alberto served as President of the Middle East Broadcasting Network, U.S. Charge d'Affaires in Sudan, the State Department's Coordinator for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, and in many other senior positions in Washington, the Middle East, and Africa, including U.S. Ambassador to Equatorial Guinea, an African nation about which I bet you don't know very much. Start with this question. What language or lingua franca is spoken there?
Of course.
Wait a minute. I'm Cliff Main. If you stay with us for this conversation, we'll tell you here on Foreign Policy. Well, welcome, Ambassador Fernandez.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be on with you, Cliff.
It's always good to see you. Hey, start by telling us just a little bit about yourself. Where are you from, and how did you get into diplomacy and related rackets?
Well, how long is this show? No, I grew up in South Florida. I'm from Miami.
Great town.
I was always interested in the Middle East growing up, so when I was 18 years old, I joined the U.S. Army to learn Arabic in the 70s.
Wow.
So that's where I first learned Arabic, and began a career in the Foreign Service, 32 years, and the rest is history.
Right. Yeah. All right. Let me start by giving you what I'd call my back of the envelope analysis of what's going on in Africa, which is hard to do. It's like 50 countries. But if I'm wrong, I want you to correct me before I make mistakes, like in a column for the Washington Times. But what I think is taking place in many parts of Africa, and I guess especially the Sahel, which people should know is a vast semi-arid region south of the Sahara. It's larger than Western Europe geographically. And certainly in that part of Africa, Western political and military influence has been shrinking, and what's taking its place is Russian military and political influence that's expanded its footprint, China, which continues to grow its economic power and influence, and others, and of course Islamist groups, which have gained ground in countries that have weak governance. Is that right? Is that a fair summation of what you see going on?
Yeah, I think that's true. That's certainly true with the Sahel. The only, I guess, point I would add is that you mentioned Russia and China. And of course, with that is kind of the weakening of traditional French influence.
I want to get to that. That's really important, yes.
But not just Russia and China. There's a whole range of other kind of regional powers projecting their influence. So you have Turkey active in the Sahel. You have Qatar. You have the UAE. You have a whole range of kind of middle powers or revisionist powers, or looking to kind of win friends and influence people, make money in different ways going on. So it's kind of a gold rush. Russia and China are two major players, China in the economic field, Russia in the security field, but it's a whole bunch of countries that are trying to.
So maybe this is unfair. Because we're in parts of the Sahel, particularly, we're talking about very clearly jihadist organizations, whether it's Boko Haram in Nigeria or Al-Shabaab in Somalia or any. But I would also say that Turkey and Qatar are both Muslim Brotherhood, and therefore they too are within the broad category of Islamist influence in Africa, even though they're more likely to wear suits and ties.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The irony, of course, is that they work with regimes. So they're working in some cases with, especially Turkey, with regimes that are fighting the jihadists. But, of course, they're a type of political Islam, whose ways we know. We've seen what they do in the Middle East as well.
And I just want to pick up on something else you said that I think is important. for a long time, the French had great influence in particularly West Africa. I lived in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast for a while. I remember during the Civil War in Chad, French Foreign Legion was there. The French have been kicked out of almost half a dozen countries, I believe, in recent months, years, with Russian influence likely replacing the French influence in these countries, right?
That's right. I mean, basically, and this part is not new. There's been resentment of France for a long time. There's been, kind of attraction or connections with France on the one hand, but also resentment. And then nationalist regimes and Russian propaganda have stoked that kind of anti-French feeling to a fever pitch. So, part of it is the fault of the French. Part of it is intentional incitement or disinformation by the Russians and their allies.
So, I mean, just a little bit personal reminiscence. When I was based in Ivory Coast, in Abidjan, and the French probably had more. There were probably more French in Abidjan then than there was during the colonial period, but they kept the trains running on time. And they literally kept the air conditioning going. So when I remember I hadn't been there long when there was a drought and there was no electricity, and as quickly and the ice. I remember I had a front page piece in the New York Times. The lead of it was something like the only ice skating rink in Africa has melted, something like that. And pretty soon the French sent in generators that ran on oil or gas or something like that, because so many of the buildings, you couldn't even open the windows because they were used to air conditioning. And the other part of what I'm saying here is that Ivory Coast in those days was fairly prosperous because Houphouët-Boigny, who was the president dictator, had kept up good relations with the French. Whereas if you went to, say, Guinea, Conakry, I say that because there's a francophone and a Lusophone Guinea-Bissau, but Guinea-Conakry, the bigger one, Sékou Touré had taken over following decolonization. He had broken with the French entirely, and that country was so dirt poor. I remember going to Conakry, and there was like not a window that wasn't broken. There were no beaches because they took the sand and made it into concrete or something for roads. I mean, it was a total wreck. And some people back then understood this is what happens if you totally cut yourself off from Europe. The African Development Bank was in Abidjan. People seem to be learning, okay, we're going to be independent, but we still have to have relations with industrialized, prosperous countries, especially ones like France that care about us and want to help us, and will even send soldiers if necessary, as they did to Chad when the Libyans were backing rebel forces. I throw that out to you to play with.
No, it's absolutely true. There were these visionaries, these African figures. You mentioned Houphouët-Boigny, who at one point, he built out of his own pocket the largest cathedral in the world.
Right.
Our Lady of Yamoussoukro, which is in his home village in the Ivory Coast in Cote d'Ivoire. Senghor in Senegal, the first Bongo, Albert Bongo, later Omar Bongo, Gabon. These were figures who were nationalist African figures who also were pro-Western, and particularly they were, pro-France.
Right.
And they found ways to kind of work with the French. You could say the French had sometimes a heavy hand, but the result was societies that more or less worked. There were more or less, there was law and order, and there was some element of economic prosperity. That's a reality that existed. And the ones that went off the deep end, whether, you mentioned Sékou Touré in Guinea or in Nguema in Equatorial Guinea, or in Nkrumah in Ghana, they all came to a bad end, and they ruined their countries, at least for a generation.
Right. All right. Let's go through a few of these countries, and let's start with Sudan. And I got to be honest with you, given the extent of the humanitarian catastrophe there, the terrible, brutal war, I've really given it myself insufficient attention. And it's complicated, isn't it? I mean, maybe just, walk us through kind of Sudan 101 with this civil war, which started, April of 2023 between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces. I don't think one person 100 knows the difference between the two. And neither are good guys. I know that.
Yeah, neither are good guys. That's an essential point. Sudan, gained its independence in 1955. For most of its history, it has been at war. It has been at war against other Sudanese.
Right.
Basically, the regime, the government in Khartoum has waged war most of its history against its own people. And that is the kind of the original sin of Sudan, or the founding flaw in Sudan, that it's always been at war against itself. And there are a lot of wild charges that are made about the current war. The RSF war against SAF being the Sudanese Armed Forces,
Right.
RSF being the Rapid Support Forces. But this is a continuation of something that's been going on for a long time, which is basically this. 40 to 50 years ago, it goes back even further back in history, but especially, say, 40 years ago, the 1980s, there was a basic problem in Sudan. The army was fighting rebels in the South Sudanese, the SPLA under John Garang. These were, Black Africans, Christians, pagans fighting Muslims.
By the way, this is an important point. The South Sudanese were Christians, and eventually the country actually split into two. But now, even though the North has almost no Christians, I think, they're still fighting among themselves, even though the whole South has gone on its own, and not done that very well, one might say, as South Sudan, either under John Garang, who was a very interesting kind of, mythical rebel figure. I remember hearing about him when I was over there.
Yeah, unfortunately, he, of course, died just as, the peace accords were signed, so we never got to see him in office. But what Khartoum did, and various Khartoum governments, Islamist and non-Islamist, including ones allied with the United States, was an old rule of warfare, which is you arm the enemies of your enemies. And that's what they did in Sudan in the 1980s. And they gave tribesmen of specific tribes, usually Arab nomadic tribes, they gave them guns, they gave them carte blanche, and they said, go, kill, rape, loot, slaughter. They did this against the Southerners. It was later done against people of Darfur. The units that the irregular forces that did that were over time formalized, and they became what became the rapid support forces. So this is a story of Frankenstein and his monster. That's the story of what happened in Sudan. Khartoum regime, the army, the army leadership of Sudan is from the Nile Valley. These are the elites that rule Sudan. And foot soldiers, the people who got their hands dirty, were from the West. They were, you could say, hillbillies or rednecks or country folk, whatever they were. And they were empowered by Khartoum to kill the enemies of Khartoum. But they eventually turned on their masters. That's what happened in 2023. And that's the problem, is these are former partners in crime. They both have blood on their hands. They're both guilty of genocide in the past. They turned on each other. That's the heart of the matter in Sudan. Everything else, this country supporting the Janjaweed, that country supporting SAF, those are important elements, but the heart of the matter is a basic flaw in the way the Sudanese rule and the Sudanese wage war.
You should just spend a second telling people what the Janjaweed are. Or who they are.
That's another term for the RSF. The Janjaweed.
It's the same thing. They grow out of that.
Technically, devils on horseback, right? That's the technical meaning. Jinn on horseback.
Okay.
Or jinn with an assault rifle. These were Arab militias, camel herding or cattle herding Arab militias that were armed by Khartoum to wreak mayhem against their enemies. They eventually got stronger and stronger, and then they said, why should we be the junior partner when we're doing all the fighting? We should be the top dog, not these fat cats from Khartoum.
And are the divisions in Sudan, northern, leave out the southern Christian South that's now independent, are they, since they're not religious, would you say they're largely ethnic or tribal? How would you characterize it?
Well, there's more than one. I mean, they are definitely ethnic. They are definitely tribal. They're also class-based. There's also an element of religion as well. The army was the traditional safe haven of the Islamists under the Bashir regime.
Right.
That's somehow exaggerated as well. So there are geographic, ethnic, and class and social differences. What there generally isn't. It's not because of Islam.
Okay.
Generally.
I do recall this. I spent time in Sudan, mostly covering famines way back when. But I also remember I got to Darfur, which you mentioned. And my understanding, you'd correct me again if I'm wrong, was that the Darfurians are seen as Africans, Black Africans, by Sudanese who self-identify as Arab, even if they have skin that's just as dark. In other words, there's a racial component, and what you say, as a class component and a sophistication, because the Darfurians are more out in the boondocks. Is that a fair characterization of what's happened? Because the Darfurians have been under attack for a long time.
Well, that's partially right. The difference is the Janjaweed, the RSF themselves, are Darfurians.
Oh, okay.
They're from Darfur as well. What you have in Darfur is you have many tribes, and some identify themselves as Africans, and others identify themselves as Arabs. And to a Westerner, you would say they're all black, different types of black. Some are, browner, some are more black, but, they look like Africans. But between them, there are tribal differences and ethnic differences, which are important. The interesting thing about the RSF, the Janjaweed, is that they have a kind of a racist view of themselves as a kind of elite against these tribes in Darfur, but also against the traditional rulers of Sudan in the Nile Valley.
Right.
They say we're a nomadic, Bedouin, elite people. These fat cats in Khartoum who've looted the country for the past 70 years are, inferior, as are these African tribes as well. So there's a kind of a real element of ethnocentrism among the Janjaweed, among the RSF.
All right, and tell us which foreign countries are supporting the Sudanese armed forces and which are supporting the rapid support forces.
Well, that's a real, is a kind of Pandora's box, but because basically everybody's got to, except for the Americans and Israel who are not involved, everybody's got a hand in it. So SAF, the Sudanese armed forces, the kind of traditional rulers of Sudan for most of its history, are supported by Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
They're supported by Eritrea, and we'll get to why all these things happen. By Egypt, by Eritrea, by Saudi Arabia, kind of, by Turkey, by Qatar.
Saudi Arabia and Qatar on the same side?
Yes, but for different reasons.
Okay.
By Russia. You have to remember at the beginning of this war, people tried to play up that the Janjaweed, the RSF, have Russian ties, and indeed they do have Russian ties. Basically, the Russians have a presence on both sides. So that's SAF. Now, when it comes to RSF, of course, the big supporter, which a lot of controversy is made about them, is the UAE. The UAE supporting the RSF.
Wait, UAE and Saudis on different sides, that's unusual too.
That's one reason. It's part of a growing trend that we're seeing in the region, which is Saudi Emirati competition, which is something relatively new in the last few years.
Right.
They used to be 2018 when they were both opposed to Qatar. They were both very much in lockstep with each other.
And opposed to the Houthis.
That's not necessarily the case today.
Okay.
And Sudan is one place where they are not exactly on the same side.
Okay.
So UAE supports the RSF. Chad supports the RSF. The Haftar regime in Libya supports the RSF. Ethiopia kind of supports the RSF, which is one reason why Eritrea supports the SAF and why Egypt supports SAF as well. So there are wheels within wheels of who supports whom and for what reason.
All right. My last question on Sudan for today is this. You mentioned that the U.S. is not involved, but when President Trump met with the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, he said the Crown Prince raised Sudan as a serious concern, and Trump said something like, yeah, we're going to do something about that. And I guess what I want to ask you is, what can the U.S. do in this case? What should the U.S. do? What should anybody do?
Well, I mean, the U.S. can do a lot because of the power that it has. Now, whether it should exert that power, that's another question. We saw something very interesting happen over the last 24 hours, which is there was some kind of proposal made by a group called the Quad. This is a group of 4 countries that care about Sudan: the U.S., Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. They form a group. And so the Quad, through the U.S. envoy for Africa, Masad Boulos, put out some kind of proposal or statement on Sudan, trying to bring about a ceasefire. And it was attacked vitriolically or violently by the head of the military, the head of the interim government, General Burhan, yesterday and today, and by the Sudanese government. They basically said, the U.S. shouldn't interfere. This is Sudan's business, Sudan for the Sudanese, which is very ironic because the difference between today and, say, 20 years ago is 20 years ago, during the first genocide in Darfur, the position of the Sudanese government was, number one, there's no genocide. Number two, you Americans stay out. You Westerners stay out, right?
Yeah.
20 years later now, the position of the Sudanese government was, there's genocide in Sudan being caused by the other guys, our former allies. And you Americans have to do something about it. What you Americans have to do is punish the UAE.
Uh-huh.
So basically what you see is the utter cynicism. Actually, both sides in the struggle in Sudan are totally cynical. Both of them want victory. They want to win. The army has said they want to exterminate the Janjaweed, and they probably want to exterminate the people who make up the Janjaweed, the tribes that make up that group. So the Janjaweed also have pursued, horrendous human rights abuses, killing thousands and thousands of people, thousands of civilians. So they're 2 bad actors. Could the U.S. do a lot? Yes, but it's basically a conflict where the 2 worst offenders are still hell-bent on more blood and more violence.
Right. You don't have 2 sides that are saying, help us get a peace process here. That's exactly not the way the world usually works. People don't get that. Okay. Let's turn to Nigeria for a few minutes. I wrote a column about Nigeria recently. You've got basically, you've got Boko Haram, you've got the Islamic State West Africa province, and I think, from what I understand, more importantly, though it gets less publicity, you've got the various Fulani militias who, and this has been controversial for a while, but I have looked at it for a long time. Again, always happy to have you tell me I'm wrong. The Fulani militias, this is not just because they are, cowboys and the Christians are farmers and they're disputing over where you put fences. The Fulanis do want the Christian lands, but they are also Islamists. And they have a real history going back to the 19th century of having caliphates and jihads, and there may be connections, I don't know, between the Fulani militias and either Boko Haram or Islamic State West Africa. Tell me what you think of it. And by the way, I bring this up second only because it's the other place where President Trump is saying, I'm going to do something. I'm sick of seeing Christian communities getting wiped out. And we've had in recent days, and you mentioned in the last 24 hours, let me just full disclosure, we're recording this on Tuesday for release on Friday. Okay, it's November 25th as we talk about this. We have had kidnappings, abductions of women. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. President Trump is really angry. The Nigerian government, he says, is not making a serious effort to protect its Christian communities. And just so people know, Nigeria is a very large country, mostly Christian in the south, mostly Muslim in the north. In the years when I lived in Africa, the Muslim north was quite calm, and you didn't fear going up to Kano or someplace like that. It was, probably better food and cleaner and all that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what's happening, of course, is a tragedy and a crisis. There's a lot of disinformation about Nigeria. What you said, everything you said is accurate. Basically, what you have, first of all, you have a basic phenomenon that exists, which is not a surprise. It exists in other places, in jihadism in Africa, which is jihadist movements in Africa take advantage, absorb, or reuse existing criminal networks that are already in some opposition to the government. This can be bandits, this can be smugglers, this can be poachers, and we've seen that. So, the weakness of the state, the creation of kind of alternate ways of making money, often dishonest ways of making money. Jihadism, jihadist groups kind of absorb and repurpose that. So they'll tell somebody, say, don't rob your fellow Muslims. You want to rob the Christians, that's okay, right? So there's kind of repurposing that happens. And so what you have in Nigeria, you have a broader phenomenon of banditry, right, of criminal gangs that exist. So there's criminality that exists in Nigeria. Within that, there are layers and layers of it. There's layers of criminality that have been absorbed by jihadist movements, formally absorbed, say like Boko Haram or Ansaru or ISWAP, Islamic State West Africa province, all three of them being originally part of Boko Haram. And then you have people who are still bandits, right? These are Fulani militias. Sometimes they're bandits, sometimes they're militias, sometimes they have ties with jihadism, sometimes they have ties with the government. So it's a fluid situation. And of course, there's a kind of myth that is put out that because lots of people that are being killed in Nigeria are Muslims, that Muslims are also targeted by Boko Haram or by these terrorist groups, that doesn't mean it's not a genocide of Christians.
Right. And by the way, we should say that, again, if my understanding is right, sure, Muslims get killed by the jihadists. The Muslims who don't want to go along with the jihad, they say, no, we've lived the traditional way of life here and we want to continue it. And you're coming in and telling us, I can't smoke cigarettes, it's anti-Muslim. Whatever it is, you're telling me you want my daughter in marriage for your third wife. No, we want to live the way we've lived here for quite a few generations without your help.
That's absolutely right. When I worked in the government and we talked about Al-Qaeda and its works, we would always say the biggest victims of Al-Qaeda are Muslims.
Right.
And that was absolutely true.
And remember the Arab awakening in Iraq was all about that.
Yes. However, that doesn't mean that they don't specifically target groups based on their religion.
Of course.
Which they did.
Yes.
Islamic State did that. So you can both be killing lots and lots of Muslims and be specifically, intentionally, in a genocidal way targeting Christians.
Yeah,
that's what's happening in Nigeria.
Right, and where it gets distorted, the people say, well, you see, because Christians and Muslims are both being targeted, it's tit for tat. No, the Christians are not out there in militias killing Muslim communities. You gotta let's get that's not what's going on. You're misunderstanding if that's what you think is happening.
Yes, jihadist groups basically target Muslims that they see as either pro-government or lukewarm or not religious enough, or they're not Salafis or they're not Salafi jihadists.
Syncretic is a word.
Target them. Just as we've seen in Syria and in Iraq and in Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be both things. It can be a targeted killing ethnic cleansing, genocidal action against Christians, and a kind of more generalized criminality and extremism happening.
Right.
But there's a very worrying phenomenon which it will come up when we talk about other countries, which is that Nigeria is full of bandits. It's full of Fulani militias. State control is shaky. You have the jihadist groups that are already there. And we very recently saw the announced presence of probably the least known, most lethal jihadist group in the world. It's not the most lethal in all the world, but it's the least known of the lethal ones or of the important ones. And that is what's called JNIM, Jamiat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin. In French, it's called GSIM, which is the heir to what used to be called Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb. And it's a coalition that happened of different jihadist groups that were forged together by two very clever jihadists. And it's the main driver of jihadism in Mali, Burkina Faso, northern Benin, and very recently into a sliver of Nigeria itself.
Okay, and that sliver is northeast?
It's northwest.
Northwest. Okay, they're coming in from like Mali. Yeah, I see.
Kind of central northwest, south of Kano. It's a kind of
south of Kano.
You could say north central.
Got it.
Northwest.
Okay.
But spreading, this is a very dynamic group, which has basically brought two countries, Mali and Burkina Faso, to their knees.
All right. Well, and we'll get to both of those. I want one more thing on Nigeria, which is so President Trump wants to do something. And the question is what he would do. I mean, I guess you could certainly have special forces assisting or training or advising, and that would be useful if the government wanted that and Trump was willing to make that investment. Is that what because you're not going to bomb the hell out of Boko Haram. You can't do that. It doesn't work.
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, what you could do is kind of a targeted support and targeted strikes as well. Kind of what the U.S. is doing, for example, now in the Horn of Africa, where it's working with local forces. Sometimes special forces are used. Sometimes drone strikes are used. There are all kinds of things that can be done. I mean, this Catholic school that was attacked, where 300 children and teachers were taken. Have more support. Does the government have guards? Does the government have, is there something we could do there? So there's a lot we can do, but obviously the heavy lifting has to be done by the Nigerian government. It needs to do a lot more.
And I've heard people say also, the local communities, the Christian communities, they're going to need to be armed and trained. They can't rely necessarily on troops sent from the South. They need to have communities need to protect themselves. They need to have the ability to self-defend. They can't rely on, even on the central government in Abuja.
That's right. And Christians have been mostly disarmed.
Right. So that's a bad mistake. By the way, you talk about using drones, but the government would then need to let you set up a drone base in Nigeria. If I remember correctly, we had one in Niger, and that got thrown out.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
As a result of the French being thrown
out. When the French were thrown out, so were the Americans. That was our most important, I think, base in West Africa to fight terrorism. It was elite troops and not a lot of them, but we had troops there working on this file.
Yes, that's where the Biden administration head of Africa went and kind of read the rulers of Niger, the Riot Act, and they said, okay, get the hell out of Niger.
Right.
Diplomacy in action.
All right, move on to Mali, which you mentioned, because that's another kind of country. Again, fascinating country, fascinating history. The French presence was there for a very long time. French were thrown out, the Russians brought in, and at this point, last I understood, the capital of Bamako was surrounded by Islamists.
Yeah.
The Russians are not even effective.
Back a little bit, which is basically 2011. Gaddafi falls.
Okay.
And Gaddafi, who's, no angel, He's a very bad guy. But the fall of his regime unleashes kind of tectonic shifts in the Sahel, and thousands of Tuareg fighters leave Libya and go back to Mali, where they succeed in basically taking over a third of the country, the northern part, and they want to set up an independent Tuareg republic, Azawad. And then they themselves are attacked by jihadists, the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb. So basically, that's when the French have to basically heighten their intervention in Mali, because the government is falling, basically caught between Tuareg nationalism and jihadism. And the French have this, operation that they sent in, to kind of try to secure things, and a very messy situation. And out of that kind of cauldron of stuff, that's where this new group, JNIM, is formed. And interestingly enough, it is formed by a former Tuareg nationalist turned jihadist.
So,
in fact, a former rock musician. There's a Tuareg rock music band that he used to be a member of, a guy named Iyag Aghali, kind of a brilliant, strange, brilliant man. Wow. He goes from Tuareg, he goes from secularism, from drinking booze and making music, to Tuareg nationalism, to jihadism.
Because Tuareg nationalism is more or less secular, you would say.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And he's the number one guy in JNIM.
Okay. Very yeah. And by the way, people should look up Tuaregs. They're a very interesting kind of romantic nation, people, whatever you want to call them. I think they wear blue robes, don't they? Remember that?
Yeah, they're the famous blue, veiled blue men of the desert.
On the horseback, the warriors. Yeah.
Fascinating,
one of the most fascinating peoples of Africa. Yeah. Wow.
So he's been very successful in forging this kind of new jihadist group, which includes, even though he's of course a Tuareg, includes Black Africans as well. His deputy is a fiery Fulani preacher, who's also very effective. And they basically have the capital of Mali surrounded, and there's kind of gasoline shortage in Bamako because the rebels surround the capital. Nobody thinks that they probably are going to take the capital. They don't have enough men to take it, but they can certainly squeeze it. They can certainly try to influence events on the ground.
Wow. And I didn't make this clear before. The Fulanis are also people of the Sahel, not just Nigeria. They stretch all the way to the West Coast. And there's like 20 or 30 million of them. It's a very large ethnic group, tribe, call what you want. I'm not going to be, the terms are flexible, I think, here. Okay. But that's fascinating, Tuaregs and Fulanis together. But of course, Islamism brings people together, because now your fellow Muslims fighting a war for in the way of Allah, with the Quran as your constitution, against the infidels, which may include your own people who have strayed, either because they're secular or because they have taken Christian or animistic practices into their brand of Islam, which is also impermissible if you're right. Right. Okay. All right. Okay. I got to get through a few more quick. Burkina Faso, interesting place as well. Experiencing a very fast-growing jihad insurgency. Older people of a certain age remember Burkina Faso used to be called Upper Volta, though there was no country called Lower Volta. But it was part of the Volta River. Anyhow, maybe just tell again. This is another place where the junta threw out the French and strengthened ties with the Russians, right? With the Wagner Group, which is now not quite the Wagner Group. But go ahead.
It's the African Corps.
It's the African Corps. It's more professionalized.
A kind of maybe reckless choice of names.
If people remember their World War II history, they'll know what you mean by that.
But Burkina Faso is also threatened by, there's a ISIS, Islamic State, Sahel risk, danger there. But the main risk is the same group that I described, JNIM, coming down from Mali. And like Mali, a huge part, maybe half, maybe 40% of the country is kind of controlled or in the shadow of this jihadist organization. So you have two countries. You actually have three countries in Africa now: Mali, Burkina Faso, and Somalia, where jihadist groups have a huge national presence. There's some places where there are regional insurgencies, like Mozambique or something like that. But these are three places where they actually, if left on their own, they might succeed in overthrowing the government.
Right.
But they're not left, these governments are not alone, so maybe they won't take over.
And just so people understand, so we talk about Somalia, and there is a place called Somalia, but there's also Somaliland, which is very different, quite pro-Western, quite pro and more secularist, and where they've kept the jihadis out. Right, Somaliland is quite different from Somalia.
Yeah, most of the fighting in what was historically Somalia is occurring in the 2/3 which are not Somaliland.
Right.
Either Puntland or what Somalia. Basically, Puntland is a breakaway part of Somalia, as if things weren't confusing enough.
Yeah.
There is intensive U.S. action right now in Somalia. To give you a sense, there have been 100 or 101 airstrikes or drone strikes by the United States in Somalia this year.
Really?
That is the highest number ever. The highest number before was in 2019. It was like in the 60s, 63, 65. It's 100 as of November 25th. There are various reasons
targeting leaders of Al-Shabaab.
Targeting leaders. There are various reasons for it. One reason is that there's actually an extremely senior Islamic State leader in Somalia. And about half of the ISIS fighters in Somalia are not Somalis. They're Arabs. They're from wherever. They're from somewhere else. But there's this one Somali guy, perfect example of I tell you, Cliff, of the craziness of our world today. There's a senior Islamic State guy in Somalia who is like really high. He's like one of the top leaders of the Islamic State, even though he's a Somali, he's not an Arab. Formerly a citizen of the United Kingdom and resident of Sweden. A guy named Abdul Qadir Mu'min, a tall black man with an orange beard, who's a very senior Islamic State guy, kind of a coordinator for the Islamic State in all of Africa. He's in Somalia. He's in the area where the U.S., obviously they're trying to hit him and hit all these non-Somali fighters that are there as well.
And we should just tell people, when you say he has an orange beard, that's not because he ate a lot of carrots. It's not because his mother was a redhead. It's not because he thinks it's prettier that way. It's a religious expression, right? Yeah.
Yes, he puts henna in his beard.
Yeah. And that has some religious significance.
It's not just a sartorial decision, but it's also considered a symbol of piety among some people.
Got it. Okay. All right, let's leave this aisle for a moment and go to Mozambique, where it's been convulsed by an Islamist insurgency almost for 10 years, like since 2017, something like that.
Yeah. Well, what you have happening in Mozambique is an attempt to take advantage of a geographical reality, which is this. The Muslim presence in East Africa, traditionally, going back, 1,000 years, was coastal people.
Right, the Swahili people
Arabic, of course, the word for coast in Arabic is Sahel.
And Swahili comes from that too, right? Swahili, exactly. Sahel, yeah.
Swahili, you could say, means coastal talk.
Yeah, because people should know Swahili is not an indigenous African language. It's a kind of patois or Creole, I don't know what you would say, of Arabic and local languages.
That's right. It's a mixture of African languages and Arabic. And so the coast of, you have Somalia, which is entirely Muslim. Then you have the coast of Kenya, the coast of Tanzania, and the coast of northern Mozambique. They're all Muslims. And so this insurgency started in the northern part of Mozambique, traditionally a poor, impoverished part of the country, the only part of the country which has a large Muslim population. Most of Mozambique is not Muslim, it's Christian.
It's Christian, right? It's part of the Portuguese Empire. It's
exactly.
Portuguese
and so
speaking, yeah.
basically you had, young men influenced by the Shabab in Somalia, influenced by jihadism, basically getting together and starting an insurgency. And they played on local grievances, and they got kind of, propaganda support from Islamic State Central, and they've built an insurgency.
Mm.
And obviously the bigger idea is not so much to spread south, because if you go south in Mozambique, it's entirely Christian. They want to kill Christians, yes, but what they want to do is ignite an Islamic insurgency along the East African coast, ideally in Tanzania and in Kenya, and places like Mombasa and places like that, there's a large Muslim population. That's the idea.
I see.
Behind this.
I see. Okay.
And of course, the Mozambique government has had trouble dealing with it. They're not very, not militarily, not very capable, and it's been a real challenge for them.
Okay. I wanted to mention, I think you had on your list, mentioned Democratic Republic of Congo. I've written about that particularly because that's where the Chinese are getting much of their cobalt for batteries and for what we call green energy. Only it's not, because you have children without even gloves mining the cobalt, putting it into bags, selling it for $1 a big bag to the Chinese, who then take it and make it for fancy cars and that sort of stuff. That kids go back to homes that have no electricity, they can't wash their hands, they have no running water. This is not green. Now, the Democratic Republic of Congo, I think the leaders have said to the U.S. Essentially, we'd much rather have your influence than China's, but you got to do that. Although the Chinese have also bought off a lot of the people. Again, I'm simplifying here, aren't I?
Well, I mean, generally, my sense has been that a lot of Africans prefer, ethical Western economic relationship if they can get it. I know in Sudan, when I was in Sudan, the Sudanese used to remember fondly. They used to have, I think it was Chevron, in Sudan, and Chevron was kicked out or left because of the Americans forced Chevron to leave because of human rights abuses in Sudan, and they were replaced by the Chinese. And the Sudanese I talked to said Chevron was a lot better than the Chinese. So that was kind of the reality they had. What's happening in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is similar to what's happening in Mozambique, which is you have a group that is basically dominating a small part of the country. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a huge country. But you have this group, which was formerly a Ugandan terrorist group, jihadist group, that was pushed out of Uganda and came down into the far northeast corner of DRC, Ituri and I forget the northern part of that province, but the part right bordering Uganda.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And Rwanda.
Yeah.
And, there are almost no Muslims in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But it's a target-rich environment to slaughter Christians, to burn churches made out of thatched, straw, to produce videos of people being beheaded and people being converted and stuff like that. And what you see in the propaganda videos from DRC by this group, this is the Islamic State Central Africa province, ISCAP. You see them encouraging Muslims from the coast to come and join the jihad. They want Muslims to come from Tanzania and from Kenya. They produce videos in Swahili, which is not a language spoken in that part of Congo, wanting to make this kind of limited jihad, because it's hard for them, a country that's 98% Christian, there's not a lot of room for them there. But if they could use that as a kind of a node, a jihadist node, they could expand back into Uganda or even go east into Tanzania, where there are many Muslims.
Right. All right, I want to squeeze this, and even though I didn't mention to you, because I think it's just so interesting. One of the former South African President Jacob Zuma's daughters is facing legal action over her role in recruiting men from South Africa to serve in Russian forces in its war against Ukraine. Now, this is from Bloomberg reporting. A group of about 20 young men were approached by her by Duduzile Zuma. They traveled to Russia in July after being told they would train as bodyguards to work for Jacob Zuma's political party. They were signed military contracts written in Russian. They couldn't read them. They were sent to the front lines in Ukraine, and after that, they lost contact with their families and that sort of thing. And President Cyril Ramaphosa ordered a probe into how this happened. But it's just interesting because you got North Koreans fighting for the Russians. Now you got South Africans fighting for the Russians, and the Russians are fighting with drones designed and in some cases made in Tehran with all sorts of support for the Russians from China. People don't understand this is a very international war.
Yeah, you have a couple thousand Cubans.
And Cubans, right. Yeah, as well.
It is an international war. Of course, you have two things. You have people that need money.
Yeah, sure.
That's why you had Colombians fighting for Ukraine. And by the way, some of those Colombians are now in Sudan, fighting for the RSF, fighting for the Janjaweed. They've gone from Ukraine to Sudan,
and they're mercenaries. They're just good.
In these war situations, you get adventurers and you get people desperate for money, and fighting is a way of being a mercenary, is an old
right.
and dishonorable tradition.
Soldier of fortune.
Yes,
remember that too. There was a magazine. I don't know if there still is. All right.
Yes.
Finally, your old haunt, Equatorial Guinea. Do you want to tell us what's happening there? Because I got to tell you, I'm totally not up on the news from Equatorial Guinea.
It's a fascinating country. Very small, one of the smallest countries in Africa. It is the country that forms the fictional basis for the country in Frederick Forsyth's Dogs of War.
Oh,
Because Frederick Forsyth was a war correspondent covering the war in Biafra. And Equatorial Guinea is mainland and a big island right off the coast of Nigeria.
Right, and Biafra is in Nigeria, right? Yeah.
There would be aid flights that used to go from Equatorial Guinea to Biafra. But Equatorial Guinea is the only Spanish-speaking country in
That's
Africa.
my trivia question. I was going to say, ask it if you're playing trivia. Say, what are they speaking? Or what's the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa? And it's Equatorial Guinea.
Yeah.
And by the way, here's one more kind of trivia question. So, an English-speaking country is Anglophone. A French-speaking country is Francophone. A Portuguese-speaking country is, this is a hard one,
Lusophone.
Good. I don't think one person 100 would know that. And a Spanish-speaking country is?
Hispanophone.
Okay. Well, if you're playing trivia, I think those are great questions to play. All right. I think I'm done for today. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up or they should bring to my attention because I shouldn't be ignorant or our listeners shouldn't be ignorant in terms of Africa?
No, not at all. It's been a pleasure. Obviously, there's a lot going on in Africa. It's significant for the world. I mean, I believe that we need to be careful in our foreign policy and not, overextend ourselves. But certainly, I think the president talking about the threat of jihadism in Africa is certainly something that we should take very seriously.
And I also think Russian and Chinese imperialism and colonialism and exploitation should be taken seriously because they'll exploit the hell out of these countries, take away the minerals, take away the riches, and leave the people desperate and dirt poor. And we know they will.
Indeed. And I'll tell you something. I'll end with something that the president of Equatorial Guinea told me once. Equatorial Guinea, by the way, is a big oil producer, and the oil is pumped by American companies. American companies do that. But when it came to buying weapons and buying equipment, because of human rights concerns, it was, the U.S. didn't want to do that. And he always told me, I prefer to buy American, but you won't sell to me, so I'll buy Chinese or Russian or whatever. It doesn't mean we need to give these countries everything they want, but we need to find a way of competing with our adversaries everywhere in this continent.
I think I totally agree with that. I think it's a good place to end. Alberto, wonderful to see you. It's been way too long since I've had a chance to chat with you. And I apologize for that, but we'll make up for it. And thank you for coming on and educating me and the listeners today. It's just great to see you.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
And thanks to all of you who have been with us today for this conversation here on Foreign Policy.